The stagecoach hit another rut in the dusty road, and Beatrice Olsen gripped the wooden seat beneath her, her heart hammering against her ribs as the small mining town of Marysvale, Utah materialized through the window like a mirage in the October heat of 1882. She pressed one trembling hand against the leather satchel that contained every letter Robert Irving had written to her over the past 8 months, words that had convinced her to leave everything she knew in Pennsylvania and travel across an entire continent to marry a man she had never seen, a man who did not know about the twisted foot that had marked her since birth and made her limp with every step she took. The coach jerked to a stop outside a weathered building with a faded sign that read General Store and Post Office, and Beatrice took a shuddering breath, trying to calm the panic that had been building in her chest for the last 3 days of travel. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, imagining the look of disappointment that would cross Robert's face when he saw her climb down from the stagecoach, the way his smile would falter when he noticed the uneven way she moved, the special boot she wore on her left foot with its built-up sole that still could not completely hide her disability. The driver opened the door and offered his hand, and Beatrice gathered her skirts and descended carefully, her left foot hitting the ground with the familiar awkward angle that made her wince. She had worn her best dress, a dark blue cotton with pearl buttons that her mother had helped her sew before she passed away 2 years ago, and she had pinned her blonde hair up neatly beneath her bonnet, but none of that would matter once Robert saw how she walked. Marysvale was smaller than she had imagined, just a handful of wooden buildings clustered along a single main street, with the dusty mountains rising up on all sides like sleeping giants. The air smelled of sage and horses and something else, something mineral and sharp, that she guessed came from the mining operations Robert had mentioned in his letters. A few men stood outside the saloon, watching her with open curiosity, and she felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment as she turned slowly, searching for the man whose words had become her lifeline during the lonely months after her mother's death. "Miss Olsen." The voice came from behind her, deep and hesitant, and Beatrice turned so quickly she nearly lost her balance. The man standing there was tall and lean, with broad shoulders and sun-darkened skin, wearing dusty work clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He removed the hat as she looked at him, revealing dark brown hair and eyes that were the color of creek water, green and brown mixed together, filled with an emotion she could not quite name. "Mr. Irving." Her own voice came out barely above a whisper, and she watched as he nodded, those unusual eyes moving over her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. He was handsome in a rough-hewn way, with strong features and a day's worth of stubble on his jaw, and she thought of all the beautiful words he had written to her, descriptions of the Utah sky at sunset, and the way the mountains looked after a rain, confessions about his loneliness and his dreams of building something lasting in this harsh landscape. "I am glad you came," he said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice that made tears prick at the corners of her eyes. He took a step forward, and she saw his gaze drop briefly to her feet before returning to her face, and her stomach twisted with dread. "Let me help you with your trunk." The driver was already hauling her battered trunk down from the top of the coach, and Robert moved to take it from him, lifting it as though it weighed nothing. Beatrice stood frozen in the dusty street, waiting for him to say something about her foot, about the way she had not mentioned it in any of her letters, about the deception that now stood between them like a wall. But Robert just settled the trunk on his shoulder and looked at her with those creek water eyes and said, "My wagon is just over there. It is not far to my ranch, maybe 5 miles out of town. Are you hungry? Tired? I have been thinking about this day for months now, and I confess I am not sure what to say now that you are really here." His honesty disarmed her, and Beatrice found herself taking a small step toward him, her uneven gait impossible to hide. "I am nervous," she admitted, deciding that if he had been honest with her, she owed him the same. "I should have told you something in my letters, Mr. Irving, something important." "Robert," he corrected gently, and then he smiled, and it transformed his entire face, making him look younger and almost boyish despite the weathered lines around his eyes. "We are going to be married, Beatrice. I think we can use our Christian names, don't you?" "Robert," she repeated, and the name felt strange and intimate on her tongue. She swallowed hard and forced herself to continue. "I have a clubfoot. I was born with it. I should have told you, but I was afraid you would not want me if you knew, and your letters, they meant so much to me after my mother died. I could not bear the thought of losing that connection." She held her breath, watching his face, waiting for the rejection she had seen so many times before, from men in her hometown who had briefly shown interest before learning about her disability, from distant relatives who had suggested she would be a burden on any man who took her as a wife. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut, and Beatrice felt tears beginning to slide down her cheeks despite her best efforts to hold them back. Then Robert set down her trunk with a soft thump and took another step toward her, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his eyes and smell the clean scent of soap mixed with dust and leather. "Beatrice," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "I fell for your letters, not your feet. The woman who wrote to me about her love of poetry and her memories of her mother's garden, who told me about the stars she could see from her bedroom window, and asked me questions about my life here that made me see everything fresh again. That is the woman I want to marry. How you walk does not change any of that." The tears came harder then, and Beatrice pressed her hands to her face, unable to stop the sob that escaped her throat. She felt Robert's hands on her shoulders, warm and solid, and then he was pulling her gently against his chest, one hand coming up to cup the back of her head through her bonnet. "I am sorry," she gasped against the rough fabric of his shirt. "I am not usually so emotional. It has been such a long journey, and I was so afraid." "I know," he said softly, and she felt his breath stir the hair at her temple. "I was afraid too. Afraid you would take one look at this dusty little town and this rough cowboy and decide you had made a terrible mistake. Afraid I had built you up in my mind into something you could never be. Afraid that my words on paper were better than anything I could be in person." Beatrice pulled back just enough to look up at him, and she saw her own fear and hope reflected in his face. "Your words were beautiful," she said. "They saved me in a way. After my mother died, I felt so alone, so purposeless. Your letters gave me something to look forward to." "Then we saved each other," Robert said, and his thumb brushed across her cheek, wiping away her tears with a gentleness that made her heart ache. "Come home with me, Beatrice. Let me show you the ranch, and we can talk about when you want to have the wedding. The circuit preacher comes through once a month, but if you want to wait to get to know me better first, I understand." The idea of waiting, of drawing out this uncertain time between arrival and marriage, filled Beatrice with a strange anxiety. She had committed to this journey, to this man, and now that she was here, now that he had accepted her despite her clubfoot, she wanted nothing more than to make it official, to begin the life she had dreamed about during those long nights in Pennsylvania. "How soon can the preacher come?" she asked, and she saw surprise flicker across Robert's face, followed by something that looked like joy. "He was here just last week," Robert said. "So it will be near a month, but there is a justice of the peace in the next town over, about 15 miles from here. We could ride there tomorrow if you want, make it legal, and then have a proper church ceremony when the preacher returns, if that matters to you." Beatrice thought about her mother, who had been deeply religious and would have wanted a church wedding, but she also thought about the practical realities of her situation. She had no money of her own, no family to return to, and nowhere else to go. More than that, she genuinely wanted to marry Robert, this man who had written such beautiful letters and who had looked at her clubfoot with compassion instead of disgust. "Tomorrow," she said firmly. "Let us go tomorrow." Robert's smile returned brighter than before, and he bent to pick up her trunk again. "Then tomorrow it is. Come on, let me show you your new home." The wagon was old but well maintained, and Robert helped her up onto the seat with a careful hand under her elbow, seeming to understand without being told that she needed a moment to position her left foot comfortably. Then he swung up beside her, taking the reins in capable hands, and they rolled out of Marysvale's small main street and onto a dirt road that led between scrubby hills dotted with juniper and pinyon pine. "Tell me about the ranch," Beatrice said, wanting to fill the silence with something other than her own nervous thoughts. "You mentioned cattle in your letters and horses." "I have about 200 head of cattle," Robert said, his eyes on the road ahead. "Not a huge operation, but enough to make a living. And I breed horses on the side, working stock mostly, but I have a few good mares that I am hoping will produce some fine colts next spring. I have a house, nothing fancy, just 3 rooms, but it is solid and the roof does not leak. There is a good well and a creek that runs through the property for most of the year." "It sounds wonderful," Beatrice said honestly. After years of living in a cramped boarding house in Pennsylvania, working as a seamstress to pay for her room and board, the idea of a real house, of land and animals and space to breathe, seemed like an impossible luxury. "I hope you think so when you see it," Robert said, and there was anxiety in his voice that made her look at him more closely. "I know it is not what you were used to back east. Things are rougher here, more primitive. But I work hard, and I am building something, and I promise you will never want for anything I can provide." "I was not used to much back east," Beatrice said quietly. "After my father died when I was 12, my mother and I struggled. She took in laundry, and when I was old enough, I learned to sew. When she got sick 2 years ago, I nursed her until the end, and after that I was alone. I lived in a boarding house with 6 other women, all of us doing piecework for the garment factories, barely earning enough to eat. Your letters offered me hope for something better, something more. I'm not afraid of hard work or rough conditions, Robert. I'm only afraid of being unwanted." Robert's hands tightened on the reins, and when he spoke, his voice was fierce. "You are wanted, Beatrice. Make no mistake about that." The intensity in his words sent a shiver through her, and she looked away, fixing her gaze on the landscape rolling past. The mountains were different from anything she had known in Pennsylvania, more stark and barren but beautiful in their own way, with layers of red and gold rock visible in the late afternoon sun. The air was dry and clear, so different from the humid heaviness of an eastern autumn, and she could see for miles in every direction, the vast openness both exhilarating and slightly terrifying. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the wagon creaking rhythmically beneath them, and Beatrice found herself stealing glances at the man beside her. In his letters, Robert had told her he was 32 years old, that he had come to Utah 10 years ago from Missouri, looking for opportunity and adventure. He had worked as a ranch hand for several years, saving every penny until he had enough to buy his own land and start his own herd. He had described the loneliness of the life, the way days could pass without seeing another human face, and he had written about wanting a partner, someone to share the work and the dreams and the quiet evenings. "There," Robert said suddenly, pointing ahead, and Beatrice followed his gesture to see a cluster of buildings nestled in a shallow valley. As they drew closer, she could make out a house built of logs with a stone chimney, a barn that looked newer than the house, and several corrals where horses moved like shadows in the fading light. It was simple and rustic, but there was something appealing about it, something that spoke of care and determination. Robert drove the wagon right up to the house and set the brake, then jumped down and came around to help Beatrice descend. This time she was ready for his hand, and she accepted his help without embarrassment, letting him steady her as her feet found the ground. "Welcome home," he said, and the word home resonated in her chest like a bell. The inside of the house was dim after the brightness outside, and Beatrice stood just inside the door while Robert lit a lantern. As the warm light spread through the space, she looked around with interest. They were standing in the main room, which served as both kitchen and living area, with a cast iron stove in one corner, a rough wooden table with 4 chairs, and a pair of armchairs positioned near the fireplace. Everything was clean but spare, clearly the domain of a man living alone. "That door leads to my bedroom," Robert said, pointing to a door on the left side of the room. "And that one goes to a smaller room I have been using for storage. I cleaned it out this week, put a bed in there, thinking you might want your own space until after we are married." Beatrice appreciated his thoughtfulness, even as a part of her whispered that they would be married tomorrow, that she would be sharing his bed soon enough. The thought made her face heat, and she turned away, pretending to examine the kitchen area more closely. "I am not much of a cook," Robert admitted, coming to stand beside her. "I can make beans and bacon and coffee, and I can roast meat without burning it too badly, but that is about the extent of my skills. I was hoping, I know you mentioned in one of your letters that you enjoyed cooking with your mother." "I did," Beatrice said, running her hand along the smooth surface of the table. "She taught me to make bread and pies, and her Sunday pot roast was famous among our neighbors." "I would be happy to cook for us, Robert. I want to contribute to be a true partner." "You will be," he assured her. "Just by being here, you already are. Let me bring in your trunk and I will show you your room. You must be exhausted." He disappeared back outside, and Beatrice took the opportunity to explore a bit more. The house was small but well built, with glazed windows that could be shuttered against the weather and wood floors that had been swept clean. On the mantel above the fireplace, she was surprised to see a small collection of books, and she moved closer to read the titles. Poetry by Whitman and Dickinson, a volume of Shakespeare's plays, a worn copy of Don Quixote, and several dime novels with lurid covers. "I am not just a rough cowboy," Robert said from behind her, and she turned to see him carrying her trunk as easily as if it were filled with feathers. "I like to read in the evenings when the work is done." "I noticed that from your letters," Beatrice said. "The way you described things, the words you chose, I could tell you were educated." "My mother was a schoolteacher," Robert said, setting the trunk down near the door to the smaller bedroom. "She made sure I could read and write and cipher before she died. I was 16 when I lost her. My father followed her a year later, and that is when I headed west." "We have that in common then," Beatrice said softly, "losing our parents, being alone." "Not alone anymore," Robert said, and the way he looked at her made her breath catch. Then he cleared his throat and gestured toward the bedroom door. "Go ahead and look. I hope it is acceptable." Beatrice opened the door and stepped into a small room with a single window that looked out toward the mountains. There was indeed a bed, narrow but neatly made with a colorful quilt, and a small dresser with a wash basin and pitcher. It was simple but clean, and she turned to Robert with a genuine smile. "It is perfect," she said. "Thank you for preparing it for me." "I will let you rest and freshen up," Robert said. "I need to see to the horses and check on the cattle before it gets full dark. There is water in the pitcher, and if you get hungry, there is bread and some dried beef in the cupboard by the stove. Make yourself at home, Beatrice. Everything here is yours now, too." He left her then, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, and Beatrice heard the front door close behind him. She stood alone in the small bedroom, surrounded by her meager possessions and the enormous change she had just made in her life. And for a moment, she felt the weight of it all pressing down on her shoulders. Then she thought of Robert's words, "I fell for your letters, not your feet," and she felt a spark of hope kindle in her chest. She unpacked her trunk carefully, hanging her 2 other dresses on pegs set into the wall and arranging her few personal items on the dresser. There was a daguerreotype of her parents from their wedding day, taken when they were both young and full of dreams, and a small wooden box that held her mother's wedding ring and a few other pieces of simple jewelry. She placed these items where she could see them, wanting to feel her mother's presence in this new place. Then she poured water into the basin and washed the dust of travel from her face and hands, taking down her hair and brushing it out before pinning it back up. She removed her special boot and examined her clubfoot, as she did every night, checking for any new sores or areas of irritation. The foot was twisted inward and downward. The toes curled in a way that made walking difficult and sometimes painful, but she had lived with it for her entire 24 years, and she had learned to manage. She heard Robert return as darkness fell, heard him moving around in the main room, the clank of a pot on the stove. After a moment's hesitation, she put her boot back on and went out to join him. "Let me help," she said, and Robert looked up from where he was attempting to slice bread with a knife that needed sharpening. "I was going to make us some supper," he said, "but I confess my earlier claim about being able to cook was generous. I am better at not starving than I am at making anything that actually tastes good." Beatrice laughed, a genuine sound that surprised her, and moved to take the knife from his hands. "Here, let me. Do you have any eggs? Butter? I could make us an omelet if you do." "There are eggs in the cellar," Robert said. "I have a few chickens, and I bought butter in town last week, should still be good." He fetched the ingredients, and Beatrice found herself falling into the familiar rhythm of cooking, cracking eggs into a bowl, beating them with a fork, heating a pan on the stove. Robert watched her with open fascination, leaning against the table with his arms crossed over his chest. "You make it look easy," he observed. "Practice," Beatrice said. "My mother believed that the way to a man's heart was through his stomach, though that never seemed to help me much back home." "The men back home were fools," Robert said flatly, and Beatrice felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the heat from the stove. They ate at the table, the simple meal of eggs and bread and butter tasting better than anything Beatrice could remember eating in months. Robert was easy to talk to, asking her questions about her journey, about the places she had seen on the train and the stagecoach, and sharing his own stories about life on the ranch. He told her about the hard winter the previous year, when he had lost a dozen head of cattle to a blizzard, and about the foal that had been born in the spring with legs so long and ungainly he had named it Stilts. "I would like to see your horses," Beatrice said as they finished eating. "Tomorrow, I mean, after we are married." "I would like that," Robert said. "And I want to show you the whole ranch, introduce you to my closest neighbors, the Hendersons. They live about 3 miles east of here, and Martha Henderson is a good woman. I think you would like her, and I know she will be glad to have another woman nearby." "I would like that too," Beatrice said. "In your letters, you made this place sound so isolated, and I worried about being lonely." "It can be isolated," Robert admitted, "especially in winter when the snow gets deep. But there is a community here, small but tight-knit. People help each other. You will not be alone, Beatrice. I promise you that." They cleaned up together, falling into an easy partnership that felt natural despite the strangeness of the situation. And when the dishes were done, Robert banked the fire in the stove and lit a candle for Beatrice to take to her room. "We should leave at first light," he said. "It will take us most of the morning to reach the next town, and I want to get there in time to see the justice of the peace before he finishes for the day. Is that agreeable to you?" "Yes," Beatrice said, taking the candle from him. Their fingers brushed in the transfer, and she felt a jolt of awareness that made her acutely conscious of how close they were standing, of how much taller he was than her, of the way his eyes seemed to darken in the flickering light. "Good night, then," Robert said, his voice rougher than it had been a moment before. "Sleep well, Beatrice." "Good night, Robert," she replied, and fled to the safety of her small room, her heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with anticipation. She lay awake for a long time that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Utah countryside, the distant howl of a coyote and the whisper of wind through the junipers. She thought about tomorrow, about standing before a justice of the peace, and pledging her life to a man she had known in person for less than a day. It should have terrified her, but instead she felt a curious sense of rightness, as though all the scattered pieces of her life were finally coming together into a coherent whole. In the other room, Robert lay in his own bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach with fear in her eyes and courage in her heart. He had meant what he said about falling for her letters, for the intelligence and humor and vulnerability she had shown in her written words. The Clubfoot had been a surprise, but not an unpleasant one, just another piece of information about this woman he was coming to know. He had seen the way she limped, the effort it took her to walk, but he had also seen her grace and determination, the way she had unpacked her belongings and cooked their supper and talked with him as though they were old friends rather than strangers bound by promises written on paper. He wanted her to be happy here, wanted to give her the home and partnership she deserved, and he found himself praying to a God he rarely spoke to that he would be worthy of the trust she was placing in him. Morning came with a wash of golden light across the mountains, and Beatrice rose early, dressing in her best dress again and taking extra care with her hair. When she emerged from her room, she found Robert already awake, dressed in clean clothes with his hair still damp from washing, looking as nervous as she felt. "Good morning," he said, and his smile was tentative but warm. "I made coffee, though I warn you it is strong enough to strip paint." Beatrice laughed and accepted the tin cup he offered her, taking a cautious sip and trying not to wince at the bitter strength of the brew. "It is fine," she lied, and Robert's grin told her he did not believe her for a second. "I have some bread and jam for the road," he said. "We should eat quickly and get going." They made the journey to the neighboring town in the wagon, the morning air crisp and cool with the promise of autumn. Robert pointed out landmarks along the way, showing her where his property ended and where the Henderson Ranch began, indicating a particular peak in the distance that could be seen from anywhere in the valley and served as a reliable navigation point. The town of Junction, Utah, was slightly larger than Marysvale, with a proper courthouse, and several stores clustered around a dusty square. Robert helped Beatrice down from the wagon and offered her his arm, which she accepted gratefully, glad for the support as they walked up the steps to the courthouse. The justice of the peace was an elderly man named Samuel Garrison, with bushy white eyebrows and a kind face. He looked them over with sharp eyes that softened when they landed on Beatrice's nervous expression. "Mail order bride?" he asked Robert, not unkindly, and Robert nodded. Yes, sir. Miss Olsen arrived yesterday from Pennsylvania. We have been corresponding for 8 months, and we wish to be married today if possible. Any objections to this union? Judge Garrison asked Beatrice directly, and she appreciated that he was giving her an out, a chance to change her mind. None, she said firmly. I wish to marry Mr. Irving. Then let us proceed, the judge said. He called in his clerk and his housekeeper to serve as witnesses, and they all stood in his office while he opened a worn book and began to read the words of the civil marriage ceremony. Beatrice felt as though she were watching the scene from a distance, as though it were happening to someone else. Robert's hand was warm and steady on hers as they repeated the vows, promising to love and honor and cherish each other for as long as they both lived. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Robert turned to her with an expression of such tenderness that Beatrice felt tears prick at her eyes for the second time in 2 days. You may kiss your bride, Judge Garrison said with a smile, and Robert bent slowly, giving Beatrice time to pull away if she wanted to. But she did not want to. She lifted her face to his, and his lips met hers in a kiss that was gentle and brief and filled with promise. They signed the marriage certificate with shaking hands, and Robert paid the judge his fee, and then they were walking back out into the bright October sunlight as husband and wife, as Beatrice Irving instead of Beatrice Olsen, and it felt both completely surreal and absolutely right. How do you feel? Robert asked as he helped her back up into the wagon, and Beatrice took a moment to consider the question. Married, she said finally, and they both laughed, some of the tension draining out of the moment. It happened so fast, I think I am still catching up with reality. We can take things slow, Robert assured her as he took up the reins. I know this is all very sudden, and I do not want you to feel pressured in any way. We are married legally, but we can take time to get to know each other properly before we become fully husband and wife. Beatrice understood what he was offering, and she appreciated his consideration even as a part of her whispered that she did not want to wait, that she had been alone and untouched for her entire life, and that the gentle man beside her had already shown her more kindness than she had any right to expect. But she simply nodded and said, Thank you, Robert. That is very thoughtful. They stopped at the general store in Junction, and Robert bought supplies, introducing Beatrice to the shopkeeper as his wife with a pride in his voice that made her cheeks flush. Then they headed back toward the ranch, taking their time, talking about the plans for the coming weeks and months. Winter comes early here, Robert said. We will need to prepare, make sure we have enough wood stocked for the stove and fireplace, get the cattle moved to the lower pastures where they can find shelter. I will teach you to shoot, in case you ever need to protect yourself or the animals. And I want to get a milk cow, maybe some more chickens, so we can be more self-sufficient. I can help with all of that, Beatrice said. I am stronger than I look, despite my foot. I may not be able to do everything a woman with 2 good feet can do, but I can do most things, and I will work hard. I never doubted that, Robert said. But I do not want you hurting yourself trying to prove something to me. We are partners now, Beatrice. That means we work together, help each other, compensate for each other's weaknesses. What are your weaknesses? Beatrice asked, genuinely curious, and Robert laughed. Terrible cooking, for one. Impatience, for another. I get an idea in my head and I want to act on it immediately, even when waiting would be smarter, and I am not always good with words when I am speaking them out loud. It is easier for me to write what I am feeling than to say it. I thought you did very well with words yesterday, Beatrice said. When you told me you fell for my letters, not my feet, that was exactly what I needed to hear. I meant every word, Robert said seriously. I want you to know that. I know this situation is strange, getting married so quickly to someone you barely know, but I am committed to making this work, to building a real partnership with you. You are not just a convenient solution to my loneliness, Beatrice. You are already becoming important to me." The sincerity in his voice made Beatrice's throat tight with emotion, and she reached across the space between them to lay her hand on his arm. "You are becoming important to me too," she said quietly. They arrived back at the ranch in the early afternoon, and Robert spent the rest of the day showing Beatrice around the property, introducing her to his horses and explaining his breeding program, walking her out to see the cattle grazing in the distance. Beatrice took it all in, asking questions and listening carefully to his answers, trying to learn as much as she could about this new life she had stepped into. That evening, they worked together to make supper, and Beatrice was pleased to discover that the house had a small root cellar stocked with potatoes and carrots and onions. She made a simple stew, using dried beef and vegetables and herbs she found hanging from the rafters, and Robert declared it the best meal he had eaten in years. After they cleaned up, Robert suggested they sit outside for a while, and they carried chairs out onto the small porch that fronted the house. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and pink, and the air was cooling rapidly now that the sun was gone. "This is my favorite time of day," Robert said, leaning back in his chair with his long legs stretched out in front of him. "When all the work is done and you can just sit and appreciate the beauty of the land." "It is beautiful," Beatrice agreed. "So different from Pennsylvania, but beautiful in its own way. Everything here seems so much bigger, so much more open. You think you will be happy here?" Robert asked, and there was vulnerability in the question that made Beatrice look at him more closely. "I think I will," she said honestly. "I think I already am in a way. For the first time in years, I feel like I have a purpose, like I belong somewhere. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Robert said. "That is exactly how I felt when I bought this land and started building the ranch, like I finally had a place in the world, something that was mine." He paused, then added, "Ours now." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, brilliant and numerous in the clear desert sky. Beatrice found herself telling Robert about her childhood, about the happy years before her father died and the harder years that followed, about her mother's strength and faith, and the way her death had left Beatrice adrift. "I answered your advertisement because I did not know what else to do," she admitted. "I could not afford to keep my room at the boarding house much longer, and the work at the factory was so soul-crushing. The same motion repeated hundreds of times a day until my fingers bled. I thought anything would be better than that, even marrying a stranger." "And now," Robert asked quietly. "Now I am glad I took the chance," Beatrice said. "You are a good man, Robert Irving, better than I had any right to hope for." Robert reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers with careful strength. "I am going to do everything I can to make you happy," he said. "I promise you that." They sat like that until the night grew too cold to be comfortable, and then they went inside, banking the fire and lighting candles. At the door to her small bedroom, Beatrice hesitated, and Robert seemed to sense her uncertainty. "Good night, wife," he said softly, and the word wife resonated in Beatrice's chest like a bell. "Good night, husband," she replied, and saw his eyes darken with an emotion she was beginning to recognize as desire. But he simply nodded and moved to his own room, and Beatrice lay alone in her narrow bed, wondering how long it would be before she gathered the courage to tell him she did not want to sleep alone anymore. The days that followed fell into a pattern that was both comfortable and strange. Beatrice woke early each morning and made breakfast while Robert did the first round of chores, checking on the animals and making sure everything had survived the night. They ate together, talking about the work that needed to be done, and then they split up to tackle different tasks. Beatrice took over all the cooking and the care of the house, scrubbing floors and washing clothes, and mending the holes she found in Robert's shirts and trousers. She also began to explore the area immediately around the house, learning where the herb garden had once been and resolving to replant it come spring, finding a patch of wild berries that she picked and made into jam. Robert worked with the cattle and horses, riding out early and returning late, but he always made time to teach Beatrice new skills. He showed her how to milk the cow he bought from a neighbor, how to collect eggs from the chickens without getting pecked, how to load and fire the rifle he insisted she keep by the door. He was patient and encouraging, never making her feel inadequate when she struggled with something, always finding ways to accommodate her clubfoot without making her feel like a burden. They rode out together one afternoon to visit the Henderson family, and Beatrice met Martha Henderson, a sturdy woman in her 40s with laugh lines around her eyes and capable hands. Martha welcomed Beatrice warmly, showing her around their ranch and peppering her with questions about her journey and her first impressions of Utah. "Robert is a good man," Martha said as they sat together on the Hendersons' porch, watching Robert and Martha's husband Tom examine a horse with a possibly injured leg. "A bit too serious sometimes, but with a good heart. I am glad he found you. He has been lonely out here by himself." "I am glad too," Beatrice said. "He has been very kind to me, very patient." Martha gave her a knowing look. "You are newlyweds, are you not? How long has it been? 2 weeks now." 16 days, Beatrice confirmed, and Martha laughed. "And how are you finding married life?" Beatrice felt her cheeks heat. The truth was that she and Robert were still sleeping in separate rooms, still dancing around each other like polite strangers in some ways, despite the growing warmth between them. She wanted more, wanted the full reality of marriage, but she did not know how to broach the subject without seeming forward or improper. "It is an adjustment," she said carefully. "We are still getting to know each other." "Take your time," Martha advised, "but do not take too much time. Life is short, and happiness should be grabbed with both hands when you find it." That night, as Beatrice prepared for bed, she thought about Martha's words. She thought about Robert's kindness and patience, about the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not watching, with hunger and tenderness mixed together in his creek water eyes. She thought about the way her heart raced when he touched her hand, when he stood close enough for her to smell his soap and leather scent. She made a decision then, standing in her small room in her nightgown with her twisted foot bare against the cool floor. She opened her door and padded across the main room to Robert's door, raising her hand to knock before her courage could fail her. "Come in," Robert's voice called, and Beatrice pushed the door open to find him sitting on the edge of his bed, pulling off his boots. He looked up in surprise, his eyes widening as he took in her nightgown and loose hair. "Beatrice, is something wrong?" "No," she said quickly. "Nothing is wrong. I wanted to talk to you about something." Robert set his boots aside and stood, and Beatrice was acutely aware of how small his bedroom was, how close they were standing, how inappropriate this whole situation would seem to anyone observing. But there was no one observing, just the two of them and the commitment they had made to each other 16 days ago. "What is it?" Robert asked gently. Beatrice took a deep breath and forced herself to meet his eyes. "I appreciate how patient you have been with me, how you have given me time to adjust and get comfortable. But I want you to know that I do not need more time. I am your wife, Robert, and I want to be your wife in every way. I want to share your bed and your life, not live like a guest in my own home." Robert stared at her for a long moment, and Beatrice felt panic rising in her chest. Had she misread the situation? Was he not attracted to her? Was he regretting his decision to marry her? Then he closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, cupping her face in his hands with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough. "I do not want you to feel obligated. I can wait as long as you need." "I am sure," Beatrice said, placing her hands over his. "I want this. I want you." Robert kissed her then, and it was nothing like the brief, chaste kiss they had shared after the ceremony. This kiss was deep and searching, full of all the desire and need they had been holding back for 16 days. Beatrice felt her knees go weak, and Robert's arm came around her waist, supporting her, pulling her closer against his solid warmth. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Robert rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that since the moment I saw you step off that stagecoach," he confessed. "Then why did you wait?" Beatrice asked, and Robert smiled. "Because I wanted you to be sure," he said. "Because you deserve time to adjust, to know me, to choose this freely." "I am choosing," Beatrice said firmly. "I choose you, Robert." He kissed her again, slower this time but no less intense, and then he picked her up as though she weighed nothing, carrying her the few steps to his bed. Beatrice tensed for a moment, self-conscious about her clubfoot, but Robert simply laid her down gently and stretched out beside her, propping himself up on one elbow so he could look at her. "You are beautiful," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made tears prick at her eyes. "Even with my foot?" she asked, hating the vulnerability in her voice but needing to hear his answer. "Every part of you," Robert said firmly. "Your foot is part of who you are, Beatrice. It does not make you less beautiful or less desirable. It just makes you you." Beatrice reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw, feeling the rasp of stubble against her fingers. "I was so afraid you would reject me when you saw it," she whispered. "I was so afraid I would spend my whole life alone." "You will never be alone again," Robert promised. "I am yours, Beatrice, for as long as you will have me." "Forever then," Beatrice said, and pulled him down for another kiss. That night, they truly became husband and wife, and Beatrice discovered a passion and tenderness in Robert that exceeded anything she had imagined during all those months of reading his letters. He was gentle with her, patient, making sure she was comfortable and taking his time despite his own evident need. And when it was over, when they lay tangled together in his bed with their hearts slowly returning to normal, Beatrice felt a sense of completion she had never experienced before, as though she had finally found the place where she belonged. "Are you all right?" Robert asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "Better than all right," Beatrice said honestly. "I am happy, Robert, truly happy." "Good," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "That is all I want, to make you happy." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, and when Beatrice woke the next morning to find sunlight streaming through the window and Robert's sleeping face inches from her own, she felt a surge of gratitude so intense it was almost painful. The weeks that followed were perhaps the happiest of Beatrice's life. She and Robert fell into an easy intimacy that encompassed both the mundane tasks of daily life and the passionate nights they spent in each other's arms. They worked together during the day, preparing the ranch for winter, and they talked for hours in the evenings, sharing stories from their pasts and dreams for their future. Robert taught Beatrice to ride, finding her a gentle mare named Daisy who was patient with her awkward mounting and dismounting. It took several tries before Beatrice figured out how to position her clubfoot in the stirrup without pain. But once she did, she discovered the joy of being able to move across the landscape faster than her own 2 feet could carry her. They rode together through the valley, and Robert showed her the boundaries of his land, the places where water could be found. the shelter where the cattle would weather the worst of the winter storms. "I want to expand," Robert told her one evening as they sat together on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the increasing cold. "I want to double the size of the herd over the next 5 years, maybe build a bigger barn and a bunkhouse for hired hands. I want to build something lasting, something we can pass on to our children." Children. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. They had been married for 2 months now, and while Beatrice had not yet shown any signs of pregnancy, the idea was always there, shimmering in the background of their lives. "How many children do you want?" Beatrice asked, and Robert smiled. "As many as God sees fit to give us," he said. "I grew up as an only child and was lonely. I would like our children to have siblings, people to rely on throughout their lives." "I would like that too," Beatrice said, "though I confess the idea of childbirth terrifies me a bit." "Martha Henderson would help," Robert assured her. "She has delivered babies for most of the families in the area. And I will be right there with you, every step of the way." November gave way to December, and the first snow fell, transforming the brown landscape into something white and magical. Robert took Beatrice to Marysvale to do some shopping for Christmas, and she was pleased to discover that she had become more comfortable walking in public, less self-conscious about her limp. The townspeople greeted her warmly, several of the women inviting her to join their sewing circle, and the shopkeeper asked her to consider making some garments to sell in his store. "You could do that," Robert said as they drove home through the falling snow, "if you wanted to. I know you enjoyed sewing, and it would give you something to do during the long winter months when you are stuck inside." "I would like that," Beatrice said. "It would make me feel useful, like I am contributing financially as well as domestically." "You contribute plenty," Robert said. "But if it would make you happy, then you should do it." Christmas came, and they celebrated quietly, just the two of them and the Hendersons, exchanging modest gifts and sharing a meal that Beatrice and Martha prepared together. Robert gave Beatrice a beautiful shawl he had bought on a trip to a larger town. Soft wool dyed in shades of blue that brought out the color of her eyes, and Beatrice gave Robert a new shirt she had made in secret, embroidering his initials on the cuff. "It is perfect," Robert said, holding the shirt up to examine her careful stitching. "You are so talented, Beatrice. I am a lucky man." "I am lucky too," Beatrice said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. January brought bitter cold and several major snowstorms that left them snowed in for days at a time. But Beatrice did not mind. She spent her days sewing and cooking and reading, and her nights curled against Robert's warmth, listening to him read aloud from the books on his shelf. They made love frequently, with an ease and passion that continued to surprise and delight her, and Beatrice felt herself falling deeper in love with her husband with each passing day. It was in late February that Beatrice began to suspect she might be pregnant. Her monthly courses, which had always been regular, failed to arrive, and she found herself feeling queasy in the mornings and overwhelmingly tired by afternoon. She waited another 2 weeks to be sure, and then she told Robert one evening after supper, watching his face carefully for his reaction. "Are you certain?" he asked, and there was such hope and joy in his voice that Beatrice felt tears spring to her eyes. "As certain as I can be without seeing a doctor," she said. "My courses are 6 weeks late, and I have all the other symptoms my mother described when she was carrying me." Robert pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and when he pulled back, she saw that his eyes were damp. "We are going to have a baby," he said wonderingly. "You are going to make me a father." "And you are going to make me a mother," Beatrice said. "Are you happy?" "Happy does not begin to cover it," Robert said. "I am overjoyed, terrified and thrilled and grateful all at once." He insisted on riding to the Henderson ranch the next day to tell Martha, who confirmed Beatrice's suspicions and estimated that the baby would arrive in late September or early October. Martha gave Beatrice advice about what to expect in the coming months, what to eat and what to avoid, and she promised to be there for the birth. "You will be fine," Martha assured her. "You are strong and healthy, and Robert will take good care of you. Just do not let him worry too much." Men are terrible when their wives are expecting, convinced that every little thing is a crisis. Martha's prediction proved accurate. As Beatrice's pregnancy progressed, Robert became increasingly protective, insisting that she rest more and work less, hovering anxiously whenever she so much as stumbled. Beatrice found it alternately endearing and exasperating, but she understood that it came from a place of love and fear, and she tried to be patient with him. Spring arrived, bringing wildflowers to the valley and new life in the form of foals and calves. Beatrice's belly grew round with their child, and she felt the baby move for the first time in May, a flutter like butterfly wings that made her gasp with wonder. She grabbed Robert's hand and placed it on her stomach, and they waited together until he felt it too, the small but unmistakable sign of the life they had created together. "That is our child," Robert said, his voice full of awe. "Our son or daughter moving around in there." "I hope it is a son," Beatrice said. "A boy who looks like you and has your good heart." "I hope it is a daughter," Robert countered. "A girl who looks like you and has your strength and courage." "We will be happy either way," Beatrice said, and Robert kissed her, his hand still resting protectively on her swollen belly. Summer came, hot and dry, and Beatrice found the heat increasingly difficult to bear as her pregnancy advanced. She moved slowly through her days, grateful for the shaded porch where she could sit and sew, working on tiny garments for the baby who would soon be joining their lives. Robert brought her water and fanned her with a piece of cardboard, and in the evenings when it was cooler, he read to her, his deep voice soothing. September arrived, and with it a sense of anticipation that was almost unbearable. Beatrice felt huge and ungainly, her clubfoot making it even harder to balance with the extra weight she carried, and she was ready for the pregnancy to be over, to meet the child she had been carrying for so many months. The labor began on a warm afternoon in late September, starting with a dull ache in her back that gradually intensified into unmistakable contractions. Robert rode to fetch Martha Henderson while Beatrice paced the house, breathing through the pain, trying to remember everything Martha had told her about what to expect. The labor lasted through the night and into the next day, long hours of pain and fear and exhaustion. Martha was a steady presence, encouraging and practical, and Robert held Beatrice's hand and let her squeeze until she thought she might break his fingers, whispering words of love and encouragement whenever she started to despair. "You can do this," he told her over and over. "You are the strongest person I know, Beatrice. You can do this." And finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, with one final tremendous effort, Beatrice brought their child into the world. The baby's cry was loud and indignant, and Martha wrapped the infant in a clean cloth and placed the bundle in Beatrice's arms. "You have a son," Martha said with a smile. "A fine, healthy boy." Beatrice looked down at the red-faced infant in her arms, at the tiny fingers curled into fists, and the dark hair plastered to his head, and she felt a surge of love so fierce and overwhelming it took her breath away. "Robert," she whispered, and her husband moved to sit beside her on the bed, his arm coming around her shoulders as they both gazed at their son. "He is perfect," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. "You did it, Beatrice. You gave us a son." "We did it," Beatrice corrected. "Together." They named him Samuel, after Robert's father, and the baby proved to be healthy and strong, with a good appetite and a pair of lungs that could wake them from the deepest sleep. Robert was a devoted father, taking his turn walking the floor with Samuel when he cried, changing diapers without complaint, and looking at his son with an expression of such love and wonder that it made Beatrice's heart ache. The first year of Samuel's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and small miracles, watching him grow and change almost daily, celebrating his first smile and his first tooth, and his first attempts to crawl. Beatrice had worried that her clubfoot would make it difficult to chase after an active child, but she found ways to manage, and Robert was always there to help when she needed it. On their second wedding anniversary, Robert gave Beatrice a gift that surprised her, a beautiful leather journal with her name embossed on the cover. "For your thoughts," he explained. "I still have all of your letters, you know, the ones you sent me before you came here. I read them sometimes when I want to remember how we started. I thought maybe you might want to write about our life now, create a record for Samuel of how we came to be a family." Beatrice was touched beyond words, and she began to write in the journal that very night, recording the story of how she had answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride, how she had stepped off a stagecoach with fear in her heart, and how a cowboy had looked at her clubfoot and said the words that had changed her life. "I fell for your letters, not your feet." The years that followed brought more children, a daughter they named Catherine, who had Robert's green-brown eyes, and then another son, Michael, who came early and small but grew into a sturdy, laughing child. The ranch prospered, the herd growing larger and healthier, and Robert was able to hire 2 ranch hands to help with the increased workload. Beatrice continued to sew, making clothes for her family and for sale in the Marysvale general store, and she became an integral part of the small community, hosting sewing circles and helping to organize church socials when the circuit preacher came through. Her clubfoot was simply a part of who she was, something her children grew up never questioning, and she rarely thought about it anymore except when it ached on cold days. She and Robert remained deeply in love, their passion tempered by time but never diminished, and they continued to talk and laugh and work together as partners in every sense of the word. They faced hardships, inevitable losses of cattle to disease or predators, dry summers that tested their resolve, and the death of Martha Henderson that hit them both hard. But they faced everything together, drawing strength from each other and from the family they had built. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Robert surprised Beatrice by taking her on a trip, leaving the children with neighbors and traveling to Salt Lake City for a long weekend. It was the farthest Beatrice had traveled since arriving in Utah, and she delighted in the bustle and activity of the larger city, the stores and restaurants and theater where Robert took her to see a play. "This is wonderful," she told him as they walked arm in arm down a busy street, "but I will be glad to get home to our children and our ranch." "That is exactly how I feel," Robert said. "I wanted to give you a taste of city life, to make sure you do not regret giving it all up to come live in the middle of nowhere with a rough cowboy." Beatrice stopped walking and turned to face him, placing her hands on his chest. "I gave up nothing," she said firmly. "I gained everything. You gave me a home and a family and a purpose. You gave me love and acceptance and partnership. I have never regretted my decision to come here, not for a single moment." Robert pulled her close, heedless of the people passing by on the street, and kissed her with a passion that made her feel 18 again instead of 34. "I love you, Beatrice Irving," he said against her lips. "I fell for your letters, and then I fell for you, and I fall for you a little more every single day." "I love you too," Beatrice said, "more than words can say." They returned home to find their children sun-browned and happy, full of stories about their adventures with the neighbors, and life resumed its comfortable rhythm. Samuel was growing into a capable young man who loved working with the horses as much as his father did. Catherine was quiet and bookish with a talent for drawing, and Michael was a whirlwind of energy who kept them all on their toes. Beatrice added 2 more children to their family over the next few years, twin girls they named Rose and Emma, who looked so much alike that only their parents could tell them apart without checking the small birthmark on Emma's left hand. The house was always full of noise and laughter, and the organized chaos of a large family, and Beatrice would not have had it any other way. She watched her children grow and thrive, marveling at the fact that none of them had inherited her clubfoot, though she would have loved them just as fiercely if they had. She taught them to read and write and cipher, to sew and cook and garden, and Robert taught them to ride and rope and care for the land and animals that sustained them. On quiet evenings, when the children were finally asleep, and she and Robert sat together on the porch watching the stars, Beatrice would sometimes think back to that terrified woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 16 years ago, and she would marvel at how far she had come, how much her life had changed. "What are you thinking about?" Robert would ask, and Beatrice would smile and take his hand. "About how lucky I am," she would say. "About how a single decision to answer an advertisement changed the entire course of my life." "I am the lucky one," Robert would insist. "You took a chance on a lonely cowboy with more dreams than sense, and you made all of those dreams come true." They would sit in comfortable silence then, hands linked, watching the stars wheel overhead in the vast Utah sky, secure in the knowledge that they had found something rare and precious. A love built on letters and sustained by mutual respect, hard work, and unwavering commitment. Years continued to pass, bringing new challenges and new joys. Samuel married a girl from Junction and brought her home to the ranch, helping his father expand the operation even further. Catherine became a teacher, taking over the small schoolhouse in Marysvale and filling it with books and laughter. Michael decided he wanted to be a veterinarian and left for schooling back east, promising to return and set up a practice in the valley. The twins remained at home, helping Beatrice with the endless work of running a large household and beginning to show interest in young men from neighboring ranches. Robert's hair went gray at the temples, and new lines appeared around his eyes and mouth, but he was still strong and capable, still the man who had looked at Beatrice's clubfoot and seen not a flaw but simply a part of who she was. Beatrice's own blonde hair gained threads of silver, and her clubfoot ached more on cold mornings, but she moved through her days with the confidence of a woman who knew her own worth, who had built a life she could be proud of. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party, inviting friends and neighbors from throughout the valley. The ranch was full of people, spilling out of the house and into the yard, and there was music and dancing and more food than Beatrice had ever seen in one place. At one point in the evening, Robert pulled her aside, away from the crowd, and led her to their favorite spot on the porch. 25 years, he said wonderingly. A quarter of a century since you stepped off that stagecoach and into my life. The best 25 years I could have imagined, Beatrice said. You kept your promise, Robert. You made me happy. You made me feel wanted and valued and loved every single day. It was easy, Robert said. Loving you has been the easiest thing I have ever done. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box, offering it to her. I have something for you. Beatrice opened the box to find a beautiful ring, gold set with a small but perfect sapphire. Robert, it is beautiful, she breathed. I wanted to give you a proper engagement ring, Robert explained. "We were married so fast, I never had the chance. I saw this in Salt Lake City last month and I knew it was meant for you. The blue reminded me of the dress you were wearing the day you arrived." Beatrice felt tears streaming down her face as Robert took the ring from the box and slid it onto her finger, right next to the simple gold band he had placed there 25 years ago. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for seeing past my clubfoot to the woman I was inside, for giving me a home and a family and a love I never dared to dream of. Thank you for answering my advertisement," Robert said. "Thank you for being brave enough to travel across the country to marry a stranger. Thank you for your letters and your love, and for giving me 5 beautiful children and a life beyond my wildest dreams." They kissed then, a long, sweet kiss that spoke of years of shared history and a future that still stretched out before them. And when they finally broke apart, they could hear their children and grandchildren and friends calling for them to come back to the party, ready to face the crowd. Robert asked, and Beatrice smiled. "With you? Always." They walked back to join the celebration, hand in hand as they had been for 25 years, as they would be for all the years to come. The party went on late into the night, with stories shared and toasts raised, and the sound of laughter echoing off the mountains that surrounded the valley. Samuel stood up at one point and raised his glass. "To my parents," he said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "Two people who found each other through letters and built a love that has been an example to all of us. My father once told my mother that he fell for her letters, not her feet, and I think that sums up everything that is beautiful about their relationship. They saw beyond the surface to what really mattered, and they built something lasting based on respect and partnership and genuine affection. Here is to 25 more years, and then 25 more after that." Everyone cheered and drank, and Beatrice wiped away happy tears while Robert squeezed her hand. She looked around at the faces surrounding her, at the children and grandchildren and friends who had become like family, at the ranch that had been transformed from a bachelor's rough homestead into a thriving family operation, and she felt a sense of profound gratitude and contentment. This was the life she had built, the life she had chosen when she answered an advertisement and boarded a train heading west. This was the family she had created with a man who had promised to love her for who she was, not despite her flaws but including them. This was the home she had made, the place where she finally belonged. As the party wound down and guests began to depart, Beatrice and Robert stood on the porch waving goodbye, their arms around each other's waists. The moon was rising over the mountains, full and bright, casting silver light across the landscape. "What are you thinking about?" Robert asked, the question he had asked her hundreds of times over their 25 years together. "About how perfect this moment is," Beatrice said. "About how grateful I am for every single day we have had together. About how I would not change a single thing about my life." "Not even your clubfoot?" Robert asked gently. "If you could go back and be born without it, would you?" Beatrice considered the question seriously. Her clubfoot had caused her pain and embarrassment and limitation throughout her life, but it had also been part of what brought her to Udall, part of what made her answer that advertisement, part of her story with Robert. "No," she said finally. "I would not change it. Because if I were different, maybe I would not have ended up here with you. Maybe I would have married someone in Pennsylvania and had a completely different life. And this life with you and our children and this ranch, this is the one I want. This is the one I choose." Robert pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I choose it too," he said. "Every day I choose it again." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the moon rise higher and the stars come out one by one. Inside the house, they could hear their daughters cleaning up, their voices and laughter floating out through the open windows. In the barn, Samuel was settling the horses for the night, singing an old cowboy song in his clear tenor voice. Life was good, Beatrice thought. Life was more than good. It was everything she had never known she wanted, everything she had been afraid to hope for during those lonely months after her mother died. And it had all started with letters, with words on paper that had revealed two lonely souls reaching out across the distance, looking for connection and understanding. She thought about those letters sometimes, the ones she had written and the ones Robert had sent in return, carefully preserved in a box in their bedroom. She had read them to the children when they were growing up, wanting them to understand how their parents had fallen in love. And now those letters were part of the family history, a tangible reminder of how something beautiful could grow from such uncertain beginnings. "We should go inside," Robert said eventually. "It has been a long day, and I confess I am not as young as I used to be." "None of us are," Beatrice agreed with a smile. "But we are still here, still together, still building our life one day at a time." They went inside, checked on the twins who were still cleaning up the kitchen, and then retired to their bedroom, the same bedroom they had shared for 25 years minus the first 16 days. Beatrice sat on the edge of the bed and removed her special boot, massaging her clubfoot with practiced hands, and Robert knelt down to help her, his touch gentle and familiar. "Does it hurt much these days?" he asked, and Beatrice shrugged. "Some days more than others," she admitted. "But it is bearable. I have had it my whole life after all. I know how to manage the pain." "I wish I could take it away for you," Robert said, and Beatrice cupped his face in her hands. "I know you do," she said, "but you have done something better. You have made it so that it does not define me, does not limit me in the ways it once did. You have given me a life where my clubfoot is just one small part of who I am, not the most important thing about me." They prepared for bed and slipped between the sheets, and as they had every night for 25 years, they reached for each other in the darkness, finding comfort and passion and home in each other's arms. Their lovemaking was slower now, more gentle but no less meaningful, and afterward they lay tangled together, hearts beating in sync. "I love you, Beatrice," Robert whispered into the darkness. "I love you too, Robert," Beatrice replied. "Today, tomorrow, and always." They drifted off to sleep like that, secure in the knowledge that they would wake up together, would face another day side by side, would continue building the life they had started with letters and promises, and a cowboy who had looked past a clubfoot to see the woman beneath. The years continued to roll by, bringing both joy and sorrow as they always do. Robert's health began to decline when he was in his early 60s, his body worn down by decades of hard physical labor. But he remained active on the ranch with Samuel's help, refusing to slow down more than absolutely necessary. Beatrice developed arthritis that made her fingers stiff and sewing more difficult, but she adapted, finding new ways to continue the work she loved. They celebrated their 30th anniversary, then their 35th, surrounded by an ever-growing family that now included great-grandchildren, small children who climbed on their laps and begged for stories about the old days. Beatrice would tell them about traveling across the country in 1882 to marry a man she had never met, about stepping off the stagecoach in Marysvale and meeting their great-grandfather for the first time. "Were you scared, great-grandma?" the children would ask, and Beatrice would nod. "I was terrified," she would admit. "I had a secret, you see, something I had not told your great-grandfather in my letters. I was afraid he would send me away when he found out." "What was your secret?" the children would ask, even though they had heard the story before, and Beatrice would show them her clubfoot, explaining how it made her different, how it made her limp. But great-grandpa did not care about that, the children would say, repeating the lesson they had learned, and Beatrice would smile. That is right. He told me he fell for my letters, not my feet, and that is how I knew he was the right man to marry. Robert would sit beside her during these storytelling sessions, holding her hand, occasionally adding his own details to the story. The children loved hearing how their great-grandparents had fallen in love, how they had built the ranch from almost nothing into the thriving operation it was today, how they had faced challenges and hardships, but had always faced them together. On their 40th anniversary, the entire family gathered again, and this time there were so many people that they had to set up tables outside to accommodate everyone. Robert and Beatrice sat at the head table, looking out at the sea of faces that represented their legacy. All the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren that had resulted from a single decision to answer an advertisement for decades earlier. "Look what we made," Robert said to Beatrice, gesturing to the crowd. "All of these people exist because you were brave enough to get on that stage, Coach. All of these people exist because you were kind enough to see past my clubfoot," Beatrice replied. "Because you valued words and character over physical perfection." "I got physical perfection too," Robert said with a wink that made Beatrice laugh and blush like a young bride. They were both in their 70s now, their bodies marked by age and hard work, but when they looked at each other, they still saw the young man and woman who had fallen in love over letters and promises. Their love had deepened over the decades, growing richer and more complex, weathering storms and celebrating triumphs, but at its core it remained what it had always been: a partnership built on mutual respect, acceptance, and genuine affection. As the sun set on their 40th anniversary celebration, Robert stood with difficulty and raised his glass for a final toast. "To my wife," he said, his voice still strong despite his years. "The woman who answered my advertisement and changed my life. The woman who showed me what real courage looks like, who gave me 5 wonderful children and more love than any man deserves. I fell for your letters 40 years ago, Beatrice, and I have been falling for you every day since. Here is to 40 more years, if God wills it, and to loving you with every breath I have left." Tears streamed down Beatrice's face as everyone raised their glasses and cheered, and she stood beside her husband, leaning on him for support as much as he leaned on her. "To my husband," she said. "The man who saw beyond my clubfoot to the woman I was inside. The man who gave me a home and a family and a love beyond measure. Thank you for 40 years of happiness. Thank you for choosing me." They kissed to wild applause from their family. And then they cut the cake that the twins had baked and decorated, and they danced, moving slowly around the makeshift dance floor while their children and grandchildren looked on with misty eyes. "I cannot believe it has been 40 years, Beatrice said as they moved in small circles, Robert's arms supporting most of her weight. "Best 40 years of my life," Robert said. "I would do it all again in a heartbeat." "So would I," Beatrice agreed. "Every single moment, even the hard ones. Because they brought us here to this moment, to this beautiful family we created." They danced until they were both exhausted, and then they sat and watched their family celebrate around them, drinking in the sound of laughter and music and joy. This was what they had built together, Beatrice thought. Not just a ranch or a family, but a legacy of love and acceptance and partnership that would continue long after they were gone. As the evening drew to a close, and their children began helping them back into the house, Beatrice looked up at the stars, the same stars she had gazed at on her first night in Utah 40 years ago, and she felt a profound sense of completion. Her life had been everything she had hoped for and more, filled with love and purpose and belonging. She had been a mail-order bride with a clubfoot, anxious and afraid, stepping off a stagecoach into an uncertain future. But she had also been brave and hopeful, willing to take a chance on a new life. And that cowboy, that wonderful man who had written such beautiful letters, had looked at her with acceptance and said the words that had given her the courage to stay. "I fell for your letters, not your feet." Those words had changed everything, had opened the door to a life of love and partnership and family. Those words had made her feel seen and valued in a way she had never experienced before. Those words had been the foundation of 40 years of marriage, and a love that would endure beyond their lifetimes. As Robert helped her into bed that night, as they settled into their familiar positions with his arm around her and her head on his chest, Beatrice felt a deep sense of peace and gratitude. She had lived a good life, a full life, a life worth living. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Robert asked sleepily. "For everything, for falling for my letters, for not caring about my feet, for 40 years of love." "Thank you," Robert replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "For being you, for choosing me, for making every day an adventure." They fell asleep like that, as they had thousands of times before, secure in their love and grateful for the life they had built together. And though neither of them knew it that night, they would have several more years together, years filled with more grandchildren and great-grandchildren, more sunsets watched from their porch, more quiet mornings and passionate nights, more laughter and tears and everything in between. Their love story, which had begun with letters exchanged between strangers, would endure as an example to their family for generations to come. Children would grow up hearing about the mail-order bride with a clubfoot who arrived anxious, and the cowboy who said, "I fell for your letters, not your feet." And they would learn that true love sees beyond physical imperfections to the soul beneath, that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a single act of faith. Beatrice and Robert Irving had built something lasting, something beautiful, something that would echo through the years long after they were gone. They had taken a chance on each other, two lonely people reaching across the distance with words on paper, and they had created a love story for the ages, a testament to the power of acceptance, partnership, and choosing to see the best in another human being. And in the end, that was all anyone could ask for: a life well lived, a love well earned, and a legacy that would continue to inspire long after the last breath was taken. The mail-order bride and her cowboy had found their happily ever after, and it was more beautiful than either of them could have imagined on that October day in 1882, when they first met in the dusty streets of Marysvale, Utah.